Now I'd like to invite all the speakers back, turn on your mics and your cameras. Also, I'd like to welcome Stephen Bellman, one of Aaron Michelin's co-authors on the benchmark for radio avoidance, and also Jonah Berger, who collaborated with Daniel McDuff on why people share ads. We have our first question from the floor, which actually could be applied to all the speakers. It was posed for Colin, but I'm going to invite all of our speakers to comment on this. The question is from Henry Assail, and that is, Colin, did you have an opportunity to break out differences by generation, specifically Gen Z? I guess the stereotype is that Gen Z have shorter attention span. That's a stereotype. I'm not saying that that is the case, but can you comment at all on it? And then after you've commented, I guess I would extend the same invitation to all of our speakers in terms of whether they saw any differences by generation. Over to you, Colin.
Sure, yeah, we didn't actually do that just because we didn't have much targeting data beyond the data we had from Unruly, and that was actually quite complex. The data just in terms of who was actually seeing the different ads they had, because it was so programmatic. But I think it would be a really interesting thing to do going forward. So I definitely encourage research. I think it would be cool to go in and break out potentially different strategies that apply more to younger generations as well.
Yeah, I found it a fascinating presentation, just sort of the elements that you featured. Okay, so let's see. How about Aaron and Steve? Any thoughts in terms of avoidance and Gen Z?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I guess from the second part of our study, we did a survey, as I mentioned in the presentation, and we did look at different age groups, and that's coming out in a second paper, so stay tuned for that. And I guess in terms of letting out a little bit of information, we didn't see a hell of a lot in terms of the differences in behavior with age groups.
You know, I wonder on radio, are Gen Zers listening to terrestrial radio, or are they much more likely to be streaming at this point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I get that a lot. Look, you know, the reach with radio is still just as big as TV. And, you know, in Australia, Pandora for us has pulled out because they weren't getting the reach, and Spotify is still sticking around. But the reach that we see in a lot of studies around is that the reach is still a lot higher with radio, particularly with the data we get from Nielsen. But yeah, look, you know, teenagers as young as 12 upwards are still listening to radio, particularly, you know, in the car, as we all do. And that might be also because they're picking up that sort of behavior from their parents as they drive around in the car.
Got it. Over to Daniel and Jonah. How about I'm guessing shareable Gen Zers are probably more likely to share content, but over to you in terms of if you had a perspective on that.
That's a good question. In this specific study, we didn't analyze age differences, but I'll let Jonah comment on maybe the broader landscape of sharing across age groups. I will just mention that there certainly are differences in how age groups express emotion, or certainly how frequently. So we do observe in our data, for instance, that older people tend to be more likely to share, to express positive emotion in response to ads. And this is something that may be linked to just generally older people being more comfortable sharing feelings, or a number of other potential psychological reasons.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I think as Daniel was saying, to me, there's sort of two parts of the two paths, right? One is the A path. How does the content affect emotion? And then one is the B path. How does the emotion evoked by the content affect sharing? And you could imagine things like age, things like culture, any sort of feature like that could moderate both paths, right? It may be certainly the case that what younger people and older people find funny is different, or what makes them smile, it may be different, at least on the margins. And in addition, there may be variance in, well, given you feel a certain emotion, how like you are to share the content as a result. You know, we talked a little bit more about culture than age in our work, but you know, in each Asian cultural context, there's differences both in felt emotion and expressed emotion once you felt it. And so you might say the same thing within cultural context with ages as well.
Got it. Fascinating. Frank, Doug, and Dave, we actually have a question from the floor for you, and that was, it's a tactical question. How did you define ad power, ad preference? That'll be for Frank, Doug, or Dave.
Doug, would you like to take that one?
Okay, sure. The metric in the study for ad effectiveness was actually CC persuasion, and that's the shift in brand preference from prior to viewing the ad to after viewing the ad. And brand preference is measured using a competitive set. We use a competitive set of images that is displayed to respondents as part of a prize drawing. And so they're asked to pick what they would like to win. Then they view the advertisement, a veiled exposure, which is embedded within programming content. And then we have the post exposure preference metric. And we look at that shift in preference from post back to the pre.
Very good. And just to keep on the theme of Gen Z, any thoughts about the effectiveness of TV advertising for Gen Z versus older populations?
Well, interestingly, we have looked at copy testing among the different generations starting way back in the 60s. I think it was called the Mustang generation back then. And consistently, taking it all the way up to millennials, not formally with Gen Z yet, but consistently we've seen lower responsiveness in terms of persuasion to advertising among younger generations. So it seems to be kind of a life stage phenomenon to a large extent. So we would expect that to continue along with Gen Z. As far as recall metrics goes, for like delayed recall type of advertising, we've seen actually higher amongst younger populations, probably due to memory considerations, but more immediate recall of the advertising is lower among the younger generations, millennials or Gen Z, probably again due to distraction, multi-screen and those types of factors.
I see. So our second theme is going to be about creative. And I think maybe we'll lead off again with Colin. Orlando Wood has a fascinating book called Lemon, in which he talks about advertising creative, sort of recapitulating phases of art history. Basically, the environment, the political, social environment basically determines whether art was flat or deep. Flat meaning very few elements, not a lot of personal interaction. Deep meaning a lot of personal interaction, people engage with each other. And so I was fascinated looking at, Colin, your clips. I actually did a kind of a count, and about half of them looked flat, a lot of hand shots and no people. But you also had a number where there was interaction. What I'm really wondering is, what do you think the trend will be in terms of 6-second ads, based on the features that you identified for success in a 6-second video ad? Do you think we're going to be moving more and more towards flat, focusing on, I think the s'mores was a perfect example. Basically, you saw ingredients in a pot and no people. Whereas the t-shirt ad with, I think, the bear on it, that was an example, for me anyway, of a more deep ad, even though it was only 6 seconds long.
It's really interesting to go through and think about it. I think it probably depends on what the objective is for the ad, right? So thinking like those simple ads like the Dunkin' Donuts one, for instance, right, where they're just trying to make a point, right? It becomes less important necessarily, who's in the actual ad itself. Whereas I think in other cases, though, if you're trying to evoke a feeling, or if you're trying to get across associations or stereotypes, things like that, and sort of evoke existing meaning, people can be really, really useful, I don't know, for lack of a better word, props in an ad, right? Because you can get so much meaning coming through. And this is probably something that, Daniel and Jonah can talk more about. But from what I understand, people can very quickly read people's faces and get emotions and feelings and get a lot of information from seeing a person in an ad. So I think we're not going to lose that, but I could see certain types of ads, those ones that are just trying to make a point, or more of like a visual billboard, so to speak, right? That they might be less important in those particular cases.
Do you know, were any of those ads basically billboards for a 15 or a 30?
Some were. We tended to find that the 15 and 30-second ones that were cut down to 6 seconds tended not to perform as well, because usually the stories were too complex and they didn't tend to lend themselves well to being cut down to 6 seconds. And that was one of the big challenges we found, that basically Unruly came to us with as a question, is they could take a 60 and make a 30 or a 15 very easily, but they had huge challenges going down to a 6-second spot. because the same message or story just wasn't able to be compressed down to basically 3 shots in those 6 seconds, right? That you would be able to go through and present.
See, my favorite was Baywatch, because they filmed The Rock about 3 blocks from my house in Miami a couple of years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Okay, over to Aaron and Steve. Wow, 2 and 3% avoidance seems spectacularly low. And then I thought about it. I mean, many years ago, I worked with passive television meters, and avoidance was more like 15%, but probably 10 of that 15% was people leaving the room, leaving 5% for channel changing. So maybe 2 or 3 for radio, not so different. Do you have any sense of whether avoidance by creative, any particular types of creative which are more effective? The other thing I noticed was, I think you said the average unit was 1 minute or longer. Is that typical for radio these days, of 1 minute ads?
It was for the data that we had collected. So it was hard. We couldn't get it any more granular than what we were given. That said, we do have other data, or the raw data, that we're just going over now. So some more research is going to come out of that.
So does that mean that the ads were 1 minute, or you had minute by minute data and the ads?
We had minute by minute data. Yeah. Correct.
Now I got it. Okay. And you said 42% were a single ad in a pod. That's it.
Yeah, correct. So what we could see was that most of those single or solo ad pods were, station promotions, or perhaps some sort of a quick ad between the weather report or the sports report and the weather report. We might get a sponsor ad come up, or some sort of public service announcement. But a lot of them were 5 to 30 seconds long. So that said, we weren't too bothered about that, because you could imagine that hearing those sort of ads, you're not going to react and then mechanically avoid that, because it's happened too quickly. So people don't have that chance to switch stations within that time frame.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so over to Daniel and Jonah. Sticking with creative, were you able to pick up any types of creative that were differential about in terms of whether or not it was likely to be shared?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly differences in base rates in terms of the types of emotions that are elicited by the content. So, for instance, the candy confectionery commercials tend to be more lighthearted, much more likely to have smile responses than, for instance, somewhat more informational ads that come with beauty products. So then, with this strong link between positive emotion, smiling, and sharing, you're likely to see those more light-hearted, maybe goofy types of ads being shared more frequently. But within product categories, of course, there will be its own variance. For instance, you often might see more of the disgust expressed to some of the food commercials, maybe to different types of instant foods or things like that.
I see. So basically, if an ad is entertaining, it's more likely to be shared.
Essentially, yeah, arousal creates a sort of activation, if you will, for people to want to share, and that can be, because they want to share that positive, potentially positive experience, or also share something that creates an emotion in someone else, even if it's negative.
Got it. So we're going to close with Frank, Doug, and Dave. You showed 4 weeks for wear out. What are your thoughts about ad stock?
Well, first, a clarification. When examining the wear out phenomenon, we looked at ads airing across a variety of time periods, including well over a year. And from this, we learned that ad wear out is related to spending. As GRPs are spent behind an ad, its selling power is delivered to market. As this occurs, the store of selling power is deleted, it's wearing out. And this is entirely related to level of spend, not a particular time period. It's a continual process, not just 4 weeks. Now, the largest share increase likely occurs in the first 4-week period when its persuasion power is the strongest. But we certainly agree with the ad stock notion and have proven it. Subsequent time periods we'll see smaller share changes and then declines versus prior period, but they're still building to a large extent on the gains of preceding periods. This is why it's important that advertising be refreshed and PRPs be monitored.
Got it. Well, our time is up. Thank you to all of our speakers for the great work that you presented.